The Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Development will come to order. I note that a quorum is present. Without objections, the chair is authorized to call a recess at any time. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on free speech on college campuses. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's hearing. The hearing is titled Diversity of Thought, Protecting Free Speech on College Campuses. What our young men and women practice and learn in colleges and universities will impact our nations for generations to come, far beyond their careers. How today's students are taught or not taught to listen to new ideas and debate with those who they disagree with will ultimately carry into their interactions in practice in Fortune 500 companies, academia, the FBI, the arts, the families, and even in the halls of Congress. Freedom of speech is a constitutionally protected, God-given right ensconced in our founding documents. Far too many higher ed institutions claim to uphold this right, accept funding from American taxpayer, and then purposely turn their backs and betray us. Our witnesses today will have extensive personal experience defending the rights for all viewpoints to be heard. The experiences of our witnesses and growing mountains of evidence regularly appearing in the news paint a dire picture of the state of free expression in post-secondary education. The American people watch with shock as video after video emerge of mobs of radicalized students attacking anyone with an opinion not aligned with theirs. These students are trained in college classrooms that bullying of others is totally acceptable, that attacking others while hiding anonymously in the midst of a group or behind a mask is virtuous. This is not virtue, but instead a height of cowardice. These cowardly attacks extend to their fellow colleagues who feel they also have the right to express and debate their earnest beliefs, to faculty attempting to voice their own ideas beyond the confines of critical race theory, and most recently and shockingly, the heckling of a federal appellate judge who was invited to speak at a law school. Those who do not conform to the mob's thoughts and words are quickly taught, you are not welcome here. The ability to speak freely, to build one's knowledge is a cornerstone of the American system and post-secondary education. And when our universities do nothing to safeguard free speech from classroom radicalized students, our future as a nation is at stake. I will leave the many appalling details of recent attacks on speech to our witnesses, but I would like to make one point. Movements to threaten speech have occurred before. If those with certain views are allowed to shut down competing views, the battle to sustain freedom upon which our country is founded, free speech, free thought, and free expression will be lost. In today's era, universities have latched onto an advancement of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, as an ideal for campuses, which is plainly stamped on college websites and spelled out in college codes. While colleges and universities may choose to focus on DEI, I would caution them that the line is crossed when they obligate or demand faculty and students to sign on to these beliefs. In fact, many universities require signed diversity statements, which are often a determining factor in student admission, faculty hiring, and tenure promotion. These statements act as a political litmus test. They insist on commitment to certain views and imply the prospective applicant will not be considered if they don't sufficiently advocate for the same beliefs. Let me remind everyone listening, we lived in the free land of America, not communist China, Cuba, North Korea, or Russia. While all the pressures to conform or avoid saying the wrong thing, it's also no wonder over half the students now self-censor. Universities are increasingly minimizing the viewpoints of those beliefs deemed unacceptable. An entire generation of young academics must tailor their work to a prescribed agenda or face professional purgatory. Even professors with tenure have no longer safe in these elite leftist-run universities as they continue to fire and threaten long-standing scholars over wrongthink. The American post-secondary education thrives when people from different backgrounds and perspectives are encouraged to express themselves. To foster a healthy environment of intellectual diversity, the American university system needs to focus on the purpose of education, the purpose and pursuit of truth. This committee should explore legislative avenues to create the right incentives to remind universities of trust that we give them as we fund them through our tax dollars. This trust is not to be an adversary to our sacred free rights of speech, but to protect it. My colleagues and I have a delicate job of considering how to ensure compliance through enforcement mechanisms that our law currently lacks. The role of American government has always been to defend the freedom of its students. This committee will not, and our fellow Americans should not, look the other way, as millions of students and great minds are silenced, disinvited, or forced to adopt beliefs antithetical to the Constitution because of a vocal minority of bullies. We're working to return to the good old days when students were taught to say with confidence, let's respectfully agree to disagree, and let's continue this debate another day. With that, I look forward to hearing this hearing today and yield to the ranking member, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Chairman Owens, and good morning. We can all agree that free speech is a constitutional right and the bedrock of our democracy. And for decades, colleges and universities have been on the front lines of protecting and advancing that right. But the majority is not apparently interested in protecting all speech. Instead, today's hearing is an example of MAGA Republicans hijacking our shared values of free speech and waging a one-sided campaign to protect conservative speech. MAGA Republicans and the far-right news media are peddling empty catchphrases like cancel culture and woke to fuel mass hysteria around an alleged conspiracy by institutions to degrade conservative free speech. This deliberately hides the real current threat to free speech on college campuses today, and that is Republican politicians' censorship of curriculum. For example, new laws in Mississippi, South Dakota, and Florida censor how public colleges can teach about racial justice. A new law in Tennessee bans public colleges from including ideas about race and sex in any seminar, training, or workshop. And a new law in Florida proposed a ban on majors and minors related to race and gender and intersectionality studies at public colleges. It also bans any initiative such as bringing a speaker to a campus related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is particularly rich that today the committee Republicans say they're concerned about diversity of thought and free speech when just last week House Republicans passed legislation to ban books and censor curriculum in K through 12 schools, actions that are contrary to our core democratic principles. And I'll say again, the real threat to the First Amendment is MAGA Republicans' extreme education agenda. Regrettably, as Republican leaders in red states increasingly censor free speech and learning, incidents of harassment towards marginalized student groups have also increased. In 2019, the Anti-Defamation League recorded 630 incidents of white supremacist activities on college campuses. In other words, Republican politicians are weaponizing the First Amendment to turn the clock back on our higher education system, defend only conservative speech, and undermine support for students most in need. And when marginalized students, those who are reasonably fearful about their safety and security, when these marginalized students petition their college administrators for help, they're often met with inaction. The First Amendment is not an excuse for inaction. Our schools have duties under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin in, quote, any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. In fact, the Department of Education has illustrated how a college university can live up to both its requirements under the First Amendment and under Title VI, saying, and I quote, "The fact that discriminatory harassment involves speech, however, does not relieve the school of its obligation to respond if speech contributes to a hostile environment. Schools can protect students from such harassment without running afoul of students' and staff First Amendment rights. Simply put, we can uphold the Constitution while also protecting the safety of our students." And while Republican politicians waste valuable time on political theater and culture wars, Democrats are continuing to build on the victories we've achieved alongside the Biden-Harris administration to meaningfully support students and families. For example, last Congress, Democrats passed, without a single Republican vote, House or Senate, the American Rescue Plan Act, which provided institutions of higher education with dedicated funding to help students avoid hunger and homelessness and other hardships during the COVID-19 pandemic. This Congress, the committee Democrats have reintroduced the Lowering Obstacles to Achievement Now, the LOAN Act, which would help address gaps in our flawed student loan system to reduce the need for students to take out crushing student loans and support current and future borrowers. I hope my colleagues will join Democrats in addressing the real challenges facing students and families and reject the Republicans' dangerous crusade against academic freedom. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you so much for that. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8C, all members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m., 14 days after the date of this hearing, which is April 12th, 2023. And without objections, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official record. I ask unanimous consent that the committee members who are not signed to this subcommittee be permitted to participate in this hearing consistent with the committee rules and practice. I will now turn to the introduction of our distinguished witnesses. Ms. Cerise Trump is Executive Director for Speech First and is in the role as the host of Speech First podcast, Well Said. Cerise brings extensive experience working directly with college students thanks to Speech First. Mr. Josiah Joener is sophomore studying economics at Stanford University. He is executive editor for the Stanford Review and has written on the various issues, including free speech on college campus. Suzanne Nossel has been the Chief Executive Officer of PEN America since 2013 and is the author of Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. Ilya Shapiro is currently serving as Director of Constitutional Studies at the Manhattan Institute. He has served in previous roles as Vice President of Cato Institute, Director of Cato's Robert A. Levy Center for the Constitutional Studies, and publisher of the Cato Supreme Court Review. Thank you again for your time for coming to meet before us. We thank all the witnesses for being here and look forward to your testimony. Pursuant to committee rules, I would ask that you each limit yourself to your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. I would also like to remind the witnesses to be aware of their responsibilities to provide accurate information to the subcommittee. I'd like first to recognize Cerise Trump.
Thank you, Chairman Owens and Ranking Member Scott, and thank you, members of the subcommittee, for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Cerise Trump. I'm the Executive Director of Speech First, a free speech advocacy organization that has successfully sued colleges over their anti-speech policies and won. Over the past year alone, I have visited dozens of campuses and spoken with thousands of students. Those students face an ever-growing, ever-present threat on campuses. That is, administrators working to chill and silence their speech. Our universities are failing miserably at the one thing they are being paid exorbitant amounts to do. They are failing to educate students. Last week, I was on one of North Carolina's university campuses, and there was a room about 50 students, and I asked them to raise their hand if they had read the Constitution, and only 5 raised their hands. So this is something that is evident that the universities are failing our students. I'll quickly mention 2 policies that are being used to target and squash unpopular speech on campuses. First are harassment policies. We all know that Title IX regulates discrimination on the basis of sex in education. But what you may not realize is that there's no limit to how many harassment policies and discrimination policies can actually exist on campus. Oftentimes, universities have multiple, and they take it upon themselves to adopt even broader definitions of harassment and discrimination. These policies completely disregard the federal guidelines that are meant to strike a balance between protecting students' First Amendment rights while also protecting students. For example, we have seen universities define harassment as offensive speech, something that threatens someone's mental health, statements that may be humiliating, or microaggressions. These are all constitutionally protected forms of speech. So I ask you, can you define what threatens someone's mental health? Can you provide an objective standard for evaluating whether a statement is humiliating? Can you actually define microaggression? Students can't either. How can one expect to enforce a policy that uses such subjective and overbroad terms? Secondly, and perhaps even more nefarious, are bias reporting systems. Bias reporting systems are anonymous reporting systems that solicit reports from students on one another for incidents of bias. Bias can be defined as anything the university wants. Oftentimes, they define a bias incident as statements that are unfair or prejudicial, jokes, stereotyping, microaggressions, not using gender-inclusive language. In some cases, even offending someone's political affiliation is a reportable offense. Once a student is reported, they often do not get to face their accuser. They are asked to meet with a member of the administration, which can often lead to writing a letter of apology and sensitivity training. Government agencies soliciting anonymous reports from citizens that lead to re-education. What does this sound like? In 2022, Speech First surveyed 821 public and private universities and found that 56% had bias reporting systems in place. This is a 200% increase over the last 5 years. Our lawsuits at Speech First challenge university policies that target, investigate, and discipline students for their constitutionally protected speech. The First Amendment should be the guide that universities use when deciding whether and how to regulate student speech, but it isn't. Universities instead try to find ways to target and suppress uncomfortable speech. Their stated goals are diversity, inclusion, safety, and other euphemisms for discrimination, and it seems the term diversity applies to everything except for diversity of thought. Currently, diversity, equity, and inclusion permeates every aspect of the college experience. In 2022, Speech First obtained freshman orientation materials from almost every major state university. Only 1/3 of the universities even mentioned free speech or viewpoint diversity in their orientation materials. This emphasis on DEI in freshman orientations is not an oversight. It is intentional, and it is clearly designed to create insecurities where there were none before. Take, for example, the definition of racism that administrators at UNLV gave to students. Racism, they say, is, quote, a socially constructed racial hierarchy that privileges white people, end quote. So this is something that is very clear to what the universities are prioritizing. In short, students are operating in a surveillance-like state. They are actively censoring themselves out of fear of espousing the wrong opinions. They don't know what could be reported for, so they choose to stay silent. Thankfully, the law's on our side. Speech First has won in the 5th, 6th, and 11th circuits on the issue of bias reporting systems, and in the 5th and 11th circuits on harassment policies. All of the policies I've mentioned today are designed to create an environment of control, not safety. I can give you plenty of examples of students who currently feel unsafe on college campuses because of these anti-speech and discriminatory environments that are encouraged by the policies that I outlined today. Keep in mind, these are the same students who will be future leaders, litigators, judges, national security advisors, tech CEOs, and bankers. What outlooks and habits are they developing on college campuses that they will bring with them into the professional world? Will we end up with leaders who are either disconcertingly compliant and avoid confrontation, or leaders who have totalitarian penchants encouraged by all those who agree with them? Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, for Ms. Trump. I'd like to next recognize Josiah Joener.
Chairman Owens, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today to share my perspective as a college student on free speech in our universities. My name is Josiah Joener. I'm a sophomore at Stanford University, and I'm an editor at the Stanford Review. There are countless examples from college campuses across the country where students and administrators have suppressed free speech on campuses. Recently, protesters and a high-ranking administrator at Stanford Law School prevented Judge Kyle Duncan from speaking. I covered this incident with my colleagues in the Stanford Review. These are the institutions currently educating the next generation of world leaders, and without a basic respect for free speech on college campuses, the integrity of both these institutions and these future leaders will slowly degrade. Unfortunately, these incidents that suppress free speech have become an all too common occurrence on college campuses. On Thursday, March 9th, Judge Kyle Duncan of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals was invited to speak at Stanford Law School by the Stanford Federalist Society. Days before the event, however, protesting students asked the Federalist Society to cancel the event or move it to an online format because of their concerns with Judge Duncan's previous statements and actions. These students posted flyers that condemned Judge Duncan and called out the individual members of the Federalist Society's board, saying that they should be ashamed. Then, on the day of Judge Duncan's Stanford speech, close to 100 students protested Judge Duncan, proceeding to enter the event and shout at him during his remarks. The student protesters heckled Judge Duncan profusely, preventing the judge from speaking in what was one of the latest examples of the heckler's veto used to suppress free speech on our campus. They held obscene signs and shouted obscene remarks, and Judge Duncan was not able to deliver his lecture. While the protests were led by dozens of students, At the center of the incident was a university administrator, Stanford Law School's Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Frustrated with the disruptive students, Judge Duncan asked for an administrator to hopefully restore normalcy to the room and allow him to speak. After his request for an administrator, Dean Tyrion Steinbeck stepped up to the podium and pulled out her prepared remarks. And in a 6-minute speech, Dean Steinbeck spoke freely, without students heckling her speech. Dean Steinbeck began by condemning Judge Duncan's harmful viewpoints, calling him out for his stances that she disagrees with. In her speech, the dean affirmed her supposed commitment to free speech, but she then continued to contradict her own words. Looking out to the crowd of protesters, those who were holding obscene signs and heckling the judge, Dean Steinbeck said, "I look out and I don't ask what is going on here. I look out and I say, I'm glad this is going on here." Dean Steinbeck condoned and encouraged the protest that silenced Judge Duncan, and her speech was met with applause from the protesters at the end. Federal marshals had to step in and escort Judge Duncan from the event, and he was effectively prevented from exercising his freedom of speech under both the First Amendment and Stanford's own policies. The incident at Stanford Law School is a very concerning example of students destroying a speaker's right to share their beliefs on campus. However, most concerning from this incident was the active role of a university administrator in violating Judge Duncan's free speech. The incident demonstrates a concerning trend in colleges: the hiring of administrators who are not committed to the principles of free speech or even the university's own policies regarding free speech. Many of these university administrators, like Dean Steinbeck, a diversity, equity, and inclusion administrator, have taken a role in universities that places a greater emphasis on restricting what is and what is not acceptable, rather than promoting diversity of thought and free speech, which spurs a functioning society and rigorous intellectual debate. It is because of incidents like this and administrators like Dean Steinbeck that students, both conservative and liberal, at Stanford and college campuses around the country are too scared to speak up in the classroom and share their viewpoints. It has instilled angst into each student for fear of sharing their opinions. Anything they say might also be viciously condemned by these same university administrators. The best option is to merely stay silent and keep one's opinions to themselves. While these administrators claim to create a more open and inclusive environment, they are in fact contributing to just the opposite: a culture which signals conformity and destroys academic debate because of fear of sharing one's opinions. Debate has been expelled from the classroom and forced to die altogether or take refuge in a few remaining groups that still offer forums for open and free discussion. We at the Stanford Review are one of those few groups on campus still dedicated to the principle of free speech and rigorous intellectual debate. We are concerned over the precedent that this sets for Stanford and other colleges across the country. This environment has exiled free expression and debate outside of the classroom, the very spot where it is most needed and essential. It is my hope that future students at our colleges do not continue to experience the degradation of free speech and face the threats that may come with sharing their opinions. This is not a conservative issue, and this is not a liberal issue. This issue of free speech is at the core of what defines our society in the United States, and without it, these institutions will fail. Congress now has an opportunity to ensure our institutions preserve First Amendment rights and protect free speech on college campuses. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I'd like to now recognize Suzanne Nossel.
Chairman Owens, Ranking Member Scott, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm the daughter of immigrants, a mother of a college freshman and high school sophomore, an attorney by training, and a proud American who served in 2 presidential administrations. PEN America, which I've led for a decade, stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression worldwide. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with an unwavering commitment to free speech, a principle that underpins democracy and a cause above politics. We at PEN America have worked on issues related to campus speech since 2016. University campus is the incubator of democratic citizenship and the breeding ground for leaders in every sector of society. If we don't get free speech and open discourse right on campus, we won't get it right in the media, the courts, or out on the streets. Our work in this area grew from concerns that a rising generation was turning its back on the principles of free speech. We learned of lecturers canceled or shouted down, faculty targeted by threats and harassments for things they said, and receiving tepid support, and sometimes none at all, from their institutions. Students often lack awareness of the First Amendment or the precepts of academic freedom, sometimes believing that the best answer to noxious ideas is to drown them out or to call on university authorities to shut them down. At PEN America, we argue that the essential drive to render American campuses more diverse, equitable, and inclusive need not and must not come at the expense of robust, uncompromising protections for free speech and academic freedom. I've written a book Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All, which centers on 20 principles for how we can live together in our diverse, digitized, and divided society without curbing free speech. A central insight of our work in this area is the idea that an open campus must uphold the ability of all students to participate freely and fully. If some students, by virtue of their background, gender, race, nationality, religion, or political views, feel hindered from speaking up in class or voicing their opinions, the marketplace of ideas suffers. Sometimes calls to curtail or punish speech are born out of a frustration that campuses or society at large have not done enough to address the lingering vestiges of racial, gender, and other forms of exclusion. While such efforts to suppress speech are misguided, I believe they cannot be effectively addressed without looking at what motivates them. Since 2021, alongside these challenges, we've confronted a new threat to open discourse on campus. We have documented proposed and enacted state legislation curtailing what can be taught and studied in college and university classrooms. There are 7 laws across 7 states that we classify as educational gag orders affecting higher education. We define educational gag orders as laws that explicitly limit what can be taught and studied on campus. As of March 16th, there were an additional 24 higher education bills pending in 15 states across the country. The wording of these gag orders is deliberately vague. It casts a willful chill on a wide swath of speech as faculty and administrators struggle to understand where the lines are drawn. Collectively, these bills are illiberal in their attempt to legislate that certain ideas and concepts are out of bounds. They're intended not to keep speech open, but to put universities on notice that they're being watched and will face the consequences if their decisions fall afoul of politics. Indeed, in pushing back against orthodoxies, the proponents of these measures have embraced and even surpassed the very tactics they claim to decry, putting the weight not only of social pressure, but of government power behind efforts to repress certain viewpoints. This year, we're also seeing a spate of alarming new tactics being introduced to curtail open discourse on campus. These include the takeover of the public New College of Florida by a group of out-of-state trustees and the advancement of HB 999 in Florida, which would abolish certain courses of study. Those who believe in the First Amendment understand that its essence lies in restricting the power of government to meddle in the realm of ideas, not in inserting the heavy hand of the state to dictate what can and cannot be taught. Escaping this escalating tit-for-tat battle of assaults on free speech on US campuses will demand leadership. University presidents need to insist and ensure that all viewpoints, left and right alike, get a fair hearing on campus. They need to speak up and resist intrusive legislation that micromanages curriculum and undercuts academic freedom. Efforts to foster diversity, equity, and inclusion on campus should span the gamut of individual differences: racial, socioeconomic, religious, ethnic, ideological, gender-based, political, and more. We also need to introduce the norms and ideals of free speech to all students and teach them how to uphold it, whether in the lecture hall or while mounting a protest. The intensifying battle for control over free expression and education should worry us all. The greatest casualty of this battle may be neither progressive nor conservative ideas, but the principle of free speech itself. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you also. I'd like to last but least to recognize Ilya Shapiro.
Thanks, Chairman Owens and distinguished members. I actually agreed with about 90% of what Suzanne just said. But thanks for this chance to share my thoughts about the state of campus free speech. I've long been a First Amendment advocate, but more recently had a lived experience in this area. Just over a year ago, I had my most direct and acute exposure to a higher ed culture that's hostile to civil discourse. Indeed, shut up was the response in more obscene terms that I got from students at UC Hastings when I tried to speak there just over a year ago about my last book, Supreme Disorder. They prevented the event from taking place, chanting and banging as if it was Occupy Wall Street. Applying a bad faith lens to a poorly phrased tweet, activists adjudged me a racist misogynist and my expertise illegitimate. I was suspended from my new position at Georgetown, pending an investigation into whether I violated university policies on harassment and discrimination. Now, those who shut down my event wanted to hear neither my reasoning about the president's Supreme Court criteria nor my broader analysis of the confirmation battle to come. The protesters also castigated their own law school for even allowing me to speak. Never mind that Hastings would be violating the First Amendment if it disapproved speakers based on the content of their speech. You'd think that law students should have a greater appreciation for open engagement with provocative ideas than undergrads. After all, lawyers face much harder situations than bad tweets. But my experience was no isolated incident, not even for March 22. The following week, a similar thing happened at Yale, at a panel bringing together lawyers from the left and the right that agreed on little other than the importance of free speech. Dean Heather Gerken basically buried her head in the sand. Then it happened again at Michigan, when students obstructed a debate on Texas's heartbeat bill. The only thing these events had in common was that speakers presented ideas that some didn't like. The trend of canceling speakers instead of challenging them represents the loss of grace in our culture more broadly, the desire to ascribe malign motives to one's political enemies, to think of them as evil, not merely wrong. As American society is secularized, politics has replaced religion to fill our spiritual needs. And in that context, it's easy to see one's political opponents as heretics. And then, of course, their sacrilege isn't worth hearing. It'll take real courage from political leaders and cultural influencers to get us back to a place where we can disagree without wanting to ruin the lives of the people with whom we disagree. As for me, after a 4-month investigation, Dean Bill Traynor cleared me on the technicality that I wasn't an employee when I tweeted. But the report from the diversity office set me up for discipline the next time that I transgressed progressive orthodoxy. Any comment that anyone found offensive would have gotten me in trouble, such as opining that racial preferences in admissions were unconstitutional. The freedom to speak is no freedom at all if it makes an exception for speech someone doesn't like. And Georgetown applies even these so-called principles inconsistently. Contrast my case with the many examples of professors tweeting much worse things from the left, castrating white men who supported Kavanaugh, for example. Because it's free speech for thee, not for me. Strong policies aren't enough if university leaders aren't willing to stand up to those who demand censorship. Proliferating DEI offices enforce an orthodoxy that stifles intellectual diversity, undermines equal opportunity, and excludes dissenting voices. It's quite Orwellian. Even the deans of elite law schools buck these political commissars at their peril. What Georgetown subjected me to, what it would have subjected me to had I stayed, is a heckler's veto that leads to a star chamber. So I made a noisy exit, and I'm using this platform to shine a light on the rot in academia. I'm generally long on America, but we may have passed the point of no return in terms of the illiberal takeover of higher education. DEI offices have broadened terms like harassment and discrimination, not to promote welcoming environments, but to enforce progressive ideology. This is not the decades-old complaint from conservatives about liberals taking over the faculty lounge. Wherever college presidents stand up for free speech, the mob disperses. But most officials are careerist bureaucrats. Deans like Traynor and Gerken aren't woke radicals. They're spineless cowards, unwilling to confront the illiberal inmates who have taken over their institutions. Schools must instill a culture of respect for opposing views and end compelled speech in the form of diversity statements. But it can't all be done from within. So we need external controls from state legislators and attorneys general, as well as congressional oversight tied to federal funding. We also need exogenous shocks like the boycott of hiring judicial clerks from Yale, led by Judge Jim Ho, which I think he should now extend to Stanford. There's still a long way to go before universities return to their mission of seeking truth and knowledge, and law schools to return to their goal of teaching future lawyers to uphold the rule of law. But the battle has been joined. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Under Committee Rule 9, we'll now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule. And I'll begin this process. Ms. Trump, the title of this hearing is Diversity of Thought, Protecting Free Speech on College Campuses. As we heard today, universities and their administrators are increasingly focused on diversity, but only diversity in a narrowly defined way. We've seen a startling lack of philosophical diversity. In some ways, college administrators should promote more aspects of diversity, such as viewpoint diversity among the students and students' faculty. Do you agree with that premise?
That universities should promote more viewpoint diversity? Absolutely, yes. And there are ways to do it. The universities could actually teach students about viewpoint diversity, which is something they often leave out of their freshman orientation materials or often do not require students to discuss in the classroom. A lot of universities actually mandate that students take DEI classes, diversity, equity, inclusion classes, in order to graduate, which often will talk about anti-racism, trigger warnings, social movements, but they usually will lead out any kind of viewpoint diversity or free speech conversation, and that's usually not a mandated requirement in order to graduate. So the first step would be for universities to actually start trying to enforce this, because administrators really do paint the environment and paint the picture on the campus. You can see a lot of examples where what the administrators believe and what their political agendas are affecting and influencing students. Oftentimes, you'll see something like at what we saw at Colorado State University, where they demonize the concept of free speech by having a sign that says, if you or someone you know has experienced a free speech event, then here are 17 counseling services we can provide you for. So this is clearly when universities are not prioritizing these concepts, students are not going to prioritize them either.
Very good. Thank you so much. Ms. Shapiro, incidents such as incidents such as what happened at Stanford University highlight the animosity among young people toward our country's founding principles. You describe the actions of DEI staff as enforcing an orthodoxy that stifles intellectual diversity, undermines equal opportunity, and excludes dissenting voices. From your perspective, how does that increasing prevalence of these DEI beliefs impact students' likelihood that they will fully embrace the principles of free speech?
The way that these DEI bureaucracies indoctrinate false values, the Orwellian sense of those magic words DEI, puts them in tension with speech, which they need not be, as Suzanne explained, or as the letter from Stanford Law Dean Jenny Martinez explained, how free expression, civil discourse is essential if we actually want appreciation for diversity and inclusion and all of those good things. So the problem is these postmodern theories about restructuring society along different social hierarchies, dismantling structures, oppressor and oppressed classes, all of these weird things that have migrated back all of a sudden subvert the classical values of speech, civil discourse, due process, and everything else that we are supposed to believe in, not just in higher ed, but in America more broadly.
Okay. How has the university setting tended to influence our culture at large?
Yeah, we used to think that what happens on campuses, well, that's just those crazy kids. Once they grow up, be exposed to the real world, things are going to change. Well, as I discussed in the Wall Street Journal weekend interview that dropped last night, all of a sudden, these students are growing up and occupying positions in society all over the place. I focus most on law schools, and that's really alarming because those are the gatekeepers of our political and legal institutions of the future, the federal judges, the corporate suites and legal offices. And if they don't believe that ideas that they don't like are worthy of hearing, then our society, our whole constitutional order is lost.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I now recognize Ranking Member Scott for the purpose of questioning the witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Joener, you mentioned the situation that happened at a law school. What was the official response from the law school to the dean's behavior?
Thank you, Congressman. So President Tessier Levine and President of Stanford University and Stanford Law School Dean Jenny Martinez issued an apology to Judge Duncan a few days after the incident occurred. And I commend the apology, and I think it was a well-written response. And then just a few days ago, about a week ago, Dean Martinez released a 10-page letter to the law school and the greater public at large that apologized for the incident and talked about how they're going to committed herself to free speech, and I commend her letter. I thought it was excellent.
Was she suspended?
Yes, the dean is currently on leave.
So that was the official response from the university. Ms. Nossel, is there a difference between unruly students and state policy?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, there is, and that's what there is a major difference, and that's what concerns me so much. We can agree on this panel on many of the same concerns about lack of grounding among students and principles of the First Amendment and freedom of speech, the need to educate them, the need to reinforce the idea that diversity, equity, inclusion need not and must not be at odds with robust protections for free speech. But the minute you insert the heavy hand of the state, that you resort to statist solutions, enacting legislation into the realm of the university, a realm that I think we all agree should be the zone of scholarship, of free inquiry, where we want faculty, people are talking about the importance of tenure, that faculty be protected from reprisals. So to enact legislation that cordons off certain concepts, that says this may not be taught, if you venture into this, you may get into trouble, you may face discipline. That, to me, as an American, honestly, is very dangerous. That is the kind of tactic that we see in repressive countries around the world, where there is no buffer zone between the hand of the state and what happens on a university campus. In our system, we have faculty, we have university leadership that creates that zone of protection for the free flow of ideas. We're not under the thumb of government at American universities. And so, look, I think we agree to a large degree on the diagnosis of the problem, and the question really becomes, what is the solution? Is the solution, here in the United States of America, with our First Amendment, where we stay the hand of government when it comes to the realm of ideas, are we really going to break with that and endorse legislation to try to adjudicate what can and can't be said on campus? I think that's a very dangerous route to go down, and we've already talked about better solutions, including training and the reinforcement of policies that can uphold the value of free speech on campus without departing from the First Amendment.
Now, do these laws that have passed limiting what can be taught and that kind of thing, does that have a partisan tinge to it?
Sorry, just repeat
Does it have a partisan tinge to it?
It does, and that's a serious concern. A principle is not a principle if it's not applied to all equally. And so to pick out and cherry pick certain ideas, certain course materials, certain theories, and say these are out of bounds, that's the core of what the First Amendment protects against: viewpoint-based discrimination, the notion that the government would be listing out particular topics, subjects of discussion, aspects of a curriculum, and saying that these are out of bounds. Some here in this room may endorse what's on those lists today, but what's going to be on those lists tomorrow?
And does that have a partisan tinge to it, Republican or Democrat?
It's Republican legislatures across the country that have enacted these laws and tabled these proposals. I'm not aware of any proposals emanating from Democratic legislatures.
Thank you. And is it possible for unchecked freedom of speech to create an hostile environment in violation of Title VI?
Can unchecked freedom of speech create a hostile environment? No. What creates a hostile environment is discriminatory harassment. That can be the origin of a hostile environment. It typically requires action, not just speech.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize the Congresswoman from Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I'm a mom of a college freshman with 2 teenagers getting ready to prepare for college. I'm certainly glad that this committee is considering this important topic, free speech on college campuses, where students should have the opportunity to think out loud, voice opinions. That's very important. Indiana has nearly 60 colleges and universities across the state, including Indiana University in my district. So I'm certainly very interested in this conversation. One thing I've heard from some students, they are fearing speaking out about their true opinions in the papers that they write for professors and in the things that they say in class. One conservative student who attends a university in Indiana, not IU, a school in Indiana, commented that he wasn't about to expose himself as a conservative to his professors because for fear that his grades would suffer and that would somehow impact his future. So that's something I'm really concerned about. Another concern is when we were touring colleges, we visited a school that had 200 student groups and not a single conservative group among them. So that leaves no opportunity for conservative students to organize. Some of the issue may be that there is not a professor willing to sponsor a conservative group on campus. So we hosted a series of roundtables earlier this month. We discussed this faculty sponsor requirement for students to form new groups on campus. I would hate to think that there are these barriers for students to convene and organize. Do you think, Ms. Trump, is this an issue that would rise to the level of discrimination of these student groups if they're unable to organize for lack of a sponsor?
So on some of the stuff that you said earlier with regards to the fear that students are feeling, being able to express their political viewpoints, that's why these clubs, these conservative clubs, are actually so vital and important to students when they do want to speak out about some of their viewpoints and ideas. I think it's really important to recognize that the fear is pretty widespread on campuses. Faculty members have told me that they intentionally do not include open discussion in their classrooms anymore because they're afraid they might have to step in and make a comment. Students have told me, on the same vein of what you mentioned earlier, a Texas student told me that he doesn't wear cowboy boots to class because that's associated with conservatives, and he knows that if his professor found out he was a conservative, he fears that he would have retaliation via his grades. So there is a serious concern, and I can keep going on various examples. But to answer your question more directly about whether this is viewpoint discrimination, the policies that are in place on campuses that are creating these environments are in the vein of viewpoint discrimination. Most students and professors are afraid to associate themselves with conservative organizations, so they oftentimes will go to these meetings in secret, and professors are usually unwilling to be faculty advisors for clubs, which is usually a requirement. So that is something that once these universities start to be more open towards various viewpoints and stop discriminating, then maybe you're going to get more conservative professors who are willing to represent these clubs on campus.
Thank you. And to Mr. Shapiro, one of the things that we've also discussed is whether this committee should consider a student's Bill of Rights. We've just passed the Parents' Bill of Rights, where we would reaffirm a student's freedom of speech rights on campus. I want to thank you for your work at the Manhattan Institute. You said something in your written testimony that I want to highlight here. The problem goes far beyond speech on campus, worrying as developments here are for the next generation. It's even more important to have a national reckoning about our inability to discuss controversial issues without canceling those with whom we disagree. I certainly could not agree more. I think it's been a common theme that many on the right have been willing to go and have those debates where we don't have the same engagement from our counterparts on the left. You mentioned jokingly maybe engaging with Whoopi Goldberg on Joe Rogan. I'm wondering, has she taken you up on that yet?
She hasn't, alas, but the offer's still open, or maybe Bill Maher, if you're listening. I'd be happy to go on your show to talk about this stuff. But look, there's absolutely a role for Congress here, and especially for state legislatures, particularly with respect to public institutions. It's not that any legislation in this area is a slippery slope to authoritarianism. You can absolutely require recipients of higher ed funds to certify they won't violate the Constitution. They'll preserve the already codified sense of Congress to protect student speech and freedom of association.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Congressman Takano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Nossel, I read in your statement that you said, quote unquote, we have decried student protests that went too far, such as at Yale, Stanford, and Georgetown. I'm assuming the Stanford reference is the same incident that happened at Stanford that Mr. Joener is speaking of.
Yes, that's right.
And so you regard that as an incident, as a protest that went too far?
Yeah, I think it was an attempted exercise of a heckler's veto, and I think the administration did not perform its proper responsibility to ensure that this invited speaker was given the opportunity to express his views and that those who came to hear him had a chance to do so. And so, that for us as a free speech organization is a concern.
Based on Mr. Joener's testimony, I would agree with you, and I would agree that universities must be protected zones with buffers all around them so that they are true places of inquiry where freedom of thought and a diversity of opinion can exist. Let me kind of go to a related topic. I noticed that you have an expertise in human rights, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, that you have done a lot of research specific to Hong Kong and China on free speech issues. Is it fair to say that the political authorities or the politicians or the political authorities in China have the ability to impose a curriculum in institutions of higher ed?
Absolutely. Those are kind of state-controlled institutions. In Hong Kong, traditionally, there was a long tradition of academic freedom, and those universities were globally respected, and there were exchanges of scholars from around the world. That really has changed. It's kind of a freeze setting in with the passage of the national security law and the imposition of a much stronger hand from Beijing. That kind of leeway in Hong Kong to talk about issues like press freedom, human rights, and dissent has diminished.
So, there was a before the Basic Law, when the Basic Law was in effect, the democratic institutions were strong, a more robust freedom of inquiry on universities. Basic Law is then undermined. The CCP of China asserts its dominance in Hong Kong. And you just described what happened at the universities. So what kind of effect did this have on the students and the professors at Chinese universities in Hong Kong?
It is chilling. Some professors have left. They don't want to teach in that kind of environment. Others have had to change their curriculum. Courses have been decommissioned because it is risky to take a stance, publish an article, talk about something in class that might fall afoul of the Beijing authorities. And we know where this leads. I mean, I'll never forget, just very briefly, meeting a young, very well-educated Chinese student who had said he had never heard of the Tiananmen Square massacre until he was in his 20s because that information was so sharply repressed. That's not what we want here.
Well, great. Are you able to draw any comparisons between what you witnessed in Hong Kong and globally to what you're seeing now transpire under Governor DeSantis in Florida and the Republican legislature?
I don't want to overstate it. I think it's really important to recognize that there are clear distinctions and we remain a free country. We're having this hearing. We can discuss these issues. But I am concerned about this legitimization of the intervention of the state and the idea that legislation, even if it's sort of loyalty oaths to the Constitution, that's not a tactic that we're comfortable with in this country.
Well, more specifically, I'm a former community college trustee. I was elected as a trustee. I don't recall ever inserting myself or the board asserting itself into the curriculum that is being taught, that was the province of the academic senate and the subject matter experts. Is that kind of a fair description of how things work in higher education?
Absolutely. I mean, we have the idea that academic freedom requires universities to be able to, it's described by the Supreme Court as the four freedoms of being able to choose what is taught, who teaches it, how it's taught, and who the students are. And the minute we intrude on that, we lose the independence and the strength of the university. Well,
Governor DeSantis himself and they have inserted themselves into a public university, replacing all the trustees and encouraging the adoption of a conservative curriculum based on the Hillsdale College of Florida. Is this something that you find disturbing?
I find it chilling that in this country they would dismantle the autonomy of a public university and take it over in that way.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize the chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Shapiro, one of the most important lessons I learned as a college president was the importance of institutional neutrality. Institutions should maintain a welcoming environment for all speech. What happens to our students and faculty when colleges selectively pick and choose speech to support? Is your mic on? Yeah. And pull your mic up to you if you don't mind.
I appreciate that question, Chairwoman Fox. It's an important one because when universities or any unit of a university takes a position on a controversy, that chills speech of students or faculty who might disagree on that position. That's why the gold standard for this sort of thing, the University of Chicago's Calvin report, recommends, and for Chicago adopted, not taking any sorts of institutional positions. So when something arises, they don't have to decide, oh, are we going to weigh in on this, or we're being pressured by both sides, how should we massage it? They can just say, we're not in the business, we're in the business of education, we're not in the business of political punditry.
And so, as a follow-up, how does this harm the role universities should play in society when they pick and choose?
Yeah, it transforms a university into an advocacy group on political controversy, not about its own interests, rather than distracting it from its mission of seeking truth, educating students, creating knowledge.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the work that you're doing every day. I really appreciate it. Mrs. Trump, the legal advocacy work at Speech First shows how necessary it still is to combat violations of free speech. I believe it's important to hold institutions accountable, but this committee has thought long and hard on how to appropriately balance federal policy. Do you believe Congress has a role to play in ensuring colleges maintain free speech environments?
Yes, Congress does have a role to play because a lot of these universities receive federal funding, and so it is the onus is on Congress a lot of times to actually make sure that these institutions are protecting the rights of the students that are going to these schools, especially federal and publicly funded schools. Additionally, if the Department of Education is enforcing policies and putting policies into place that are violating students' First Amendment rights, then Congress has a role to investigate what's going on at the Department of Education and why they feel the need to do that. Also, there's a lot of definitions under Title IX and Title VI of harassment and discrimination that are ever changing with every administration. It would be wonderful if Congress could codify some of these definitions.
I love the Constitution, and it seems to me it's pretty firm on what it says. But yes, I believe you're right that we have a role to play here, although it's a very delicate role to play. Mr. Joener, I passionately believe that colleges and universities should prepare students to be lifelong learners. It's important to graciously engage with ideas and people with whom you disagree. But as we've seen from today's testimonies, institutions are not promoting this key part of learning. Based on your perspective as a current student, how can colleges better equip the next generation to value free speech?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. What I've seen on campus is that after incidents like this at Stanford Law School and other incidents across the country is that it's stifling free speech in our classrooms, that both conservative and liberal students don't feel comfortable to speak out. It's exiled debate into these other rooms, and in order to enforce this, we need to have university administrators who are in place and able to enforce the basic principles of free speech and make sure that students are respecting these. And what we've seen is that administrators at Stanford Law School just a couple weeks ago were not doing their job to enforce the principles of free speech and the university's own policies on free speech.
Thank you very much again to our witnesses for being here today. This is an extremely important topic on the minds of Americans, on the minds of college students. And I think it's important that we have held this hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Mr. Cano to enter some materials into the record.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'd like to enter into the record this memo by Jenny S. Martinez, the Richard E. Lang Professor of Law and Dean of Stanford Law School, that she issued in response to the incident.
No objection.
Thank you.
I'd like now to recognize Ms. Bonamici. I'm sorry, Bonamici.
Thank you so much to the chair and ranking member. I agree with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that it's important to protect free speech at public and private colleges around the country. Public colleges have a constitutional obligation, as we've heard, to uphold free speech on campus, and public and private colleges have a responsibility to provide each student with a higher education that's intellectually stimulating, challenges their worldview, and exposes them to perspectives different from their own. And to my knowledge, the vast majority of colleges are upholding this obligation and this responsibility. I'm deeply concerned about the academic censorship at all levels, and including in higher education, that's being advanced by several Republican leaders, especially at the state level. Most recently, as our colleagues described, Florida Republicans took steps to prohibit public colleges in the state from mentioning or working on anything related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Mr. Chair, this is actual censorship. silencing voices you don't agree with, and I urge you and your colleagues to do some much-needed introspection before distracting the American people from the real issues at hand, which is a systematic assault on democratic values and increasing unaffordability of college. I want to note that I agree with Berkeley Law School Dean Chemerinsky, his statement that freedom of speech does not protect a right to shut down others, and I thank you, Mr. Shapiro, for citing Dean Chemerinsky. But I also, although I agree that you absolutely, Mr. Shapiro, have a right to call Deans Traynor and Gherkin, quote, spineless cowards who are unwilling to confront the illiberal inmates who have taken over their institutions, end quote, I find statements like that to be unnecessarily inflammatory and not helpful to finding solutions to the challenges we're discussing today. My question is for Ms. Nossel, and I thank you for your testimony. I'm acutely aware of the fine line between free speech and hate speech or harassment on college campuses, and I appreciate the work you do for free expression for all. Thank you to PEN America. So, Ms. Nossel, where does the line of freedom of expression start and end on a college campus, and are there situations where there should be parameters placed on such expression?
You know, we have well-established First Amendment law that defines things like true threats, harassment that are not protected speech, that can be banned and punished. And so, you know, that should be our lodestar star. I don't think we should be passing new legislation that puts new categories of information and expression out of bounds, that we don't have under the First Amendment laws that dictate what can and can't be in the curriculum. You know, to us, that evokes the McCarthy era. You know,
I agree. I find that very problematic. Can we talk about private colleges for a minute? Should they consider the distinction between free speech allowed under their respective codes of conduct, because of course it's not a First Amendment issue, and speech that would otherwise be considered prohibited by the First Amendment, threatening violence, for example?
I mean, most private colleges have staunch free speech obligations of their own that they've voluntarily undertaken. So as part of a mission statement or university policy, many of the universities like Stanford that we're talking about have adopted those policies. And I think that's extremely important because, again, they're incubators of democratic citizenship. We want students on those campuses to be exposed to all ideas. And I think that's why it's so important that the leadership of Stanford University did step in and say this was not handled appropriately, and here's what our principles are.
And I absolutely agree with that. I agree it's important for students to be exposed to different and sometimes uncomfortable perspectives in college. And as you mentioned, that's how they get prepared to be in the real world. But do you agree that it's also important for colleges, public and private, to consider the mental and physical health and safety of students, and is it important for them to have policies in place before a controversial speaker or a large protest is expected on campus? So how and if so, how can they strengthen existing policies and better educate faculty and students on the parameters of their free speech rights and on-campus policies?
Yeah, sure. Of course, a university has to ensure physical safety. That's paramount. And there is a lot that they can do to lay the groundwork to protect free speech without impinging upon physical safety. They can have policies that allow people to protest outside, that allow them to protest in ways that don't disrupt. There can be very powerful, potent protests that get the message across without interfering with people's ability to listen to a speaker. And I think pushing those policies, educating students, educating faculty, ensuring this is part of the curriculum, part of a freshman orientation, would instill those values and get people to come to grips with those values.
Are there some institutions, and I don't mean to cut you off, but the clock is ticking. Are there
No.
some institutions that are doing that well?
Some are. We're doing free speech institutes at PEN America that are very well received. We're working with universities across the country, but it needs to be much more widespread.
I appreciate that. And as I yield back, Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement from the American Psychological Association in support of the right of educators to do their jobs without political interference.
No objections.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like now to recognize Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would like to include for the record a study from the Heritage Foundation titled Inclusion Delusion: The Anti-Semitism of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Staff at Universities, dated December 8, 2021, by Dr. Jay Green and James Paul.
No objection.
Thank you. Dr. Shapiro, is wokeism, or more specifically DEI programs, a gateway to anti-Semitism and even hatred or violence towards people of faith?
Absolutely. It seems that Jews are not part of the latest hierarchy of intersectionality, and they're too privileged in various ways, and certainly the growth of DEI bureaucracies and programs has been correlated with the growth of anti-Semitism.
Can you talk about how they, how DEI programs foster hatred toward people of faith?
Well, they foster illiberal attitudes of all kinds. And again, this is not, as Suzanne said, the words diversity, equity, inclusion, nobody could disagree with their facial meaning. Intellectual diversity, people wanting to feel welcome, treated fairly, equitably, that's great. But the way that they've been perverted, you ask about religious groups, there are plenty rife examples of religious groups that are not treated the same as secular groups of various kinds. Even though the Supreme Court ruled more than 25 years ago in Rosenberger versus UVA that if you provide certain types of resources, you should provide them equally, equitably to religious organizations as well.
The study that I just mentioned from the Heritage Foundation, 2021, found that DEI-related staff on American college campuses were overwhelmingly anti-Israel, and a majority were indifferent or even agreeable to the Chinese Communist Party. Based on a search of over 700 Twitter accounts of DEI staff on campuses across the country, just 28 tweets were found to be favorable toward Israel, while 605 tweets were negative. 133 tweets were pro-China, while just 83 of the overall tweets were negative. Doesn't it seem like these DEI staff are in themselves aren't very diverse in their viewpoints?
That's true. I mean, they have their individual constitutional rights as well to speak on however they like, but those kinds of views definitely are imbued in the trainings that we've seen, the materials of the various kinds of programmings that they promulgate. And since you're citing studies, I have another Heritage study. I can't enter it, but I recommend that you look at Heritage Backgrounder 3641 by the same authors, Jay Green and James Paul, titled Diversity University, DEI Bloat in the Academy. And that addresses a host of these issues, including one of your colleagues mentioned the increasing cost, and the growth in bureaucracy certainly contributes to that as well.
$190 billion a year that the federal government gives to colleges and universities. What can we do to stop universities from hiring these DEI or woke programs that directly attack people of faith?
Well, I think the federal government spends too much money on almost everything, and this is certainly an area where cutbacks are, I think, appropriate, but at least attach heavier strings, constitutionally based, values-based of classical liberalism that we're all supposed to agree on in the broad polity.
Seems like quite a problem that we have, and I'm deeply concerned that the leadership, the administrations of our universities are hiring these woke officials, DEI programs that attack people of whatever faith. So I appreciate you bringing light to that. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Can I say one more thing, Mr. Banks?
I have 48 seconds left.
Yeah. I just want to clarify, and I think you probably would agree with this distinction between the DEI bureaucracies and staffs and the sorts of folks working on civil rights compliance, Title IX, ADA, all of these things that we would have recognized from our time in college and graduate school 20, 25, 30 years ago. This is a fairly recent phenomenon, so it's not about shutting down student groups that want to care about their ethnic backgrounds or anything like that. It's about institutional promulgation of illiberal postmodern theories.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Ms. Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. We have seen a rise of anti-Semitism on college campuses across the country, and according to ADL's most recent audit of anti-Semitic incidents, anti-Semitic activity on college and university campuses has increased by 41% in 2022 compared to the previous year. College and university leaders play a key role in responding to these types of situations. They must ensure that no one is punished for their protected speech, just because it discomforts some, and simultaneously, they must use their moral authority to counter hateful and anti-Semitic speech with timely, specific, and direct responses. So how can administrators, staff, faculty, and all community members more effectively respond to hateful speech, including anti-Semitic speech, while fulfilling the promise of creating educational institutions that both safeguard free expression and ensure that all members of the community feel safe and welcome? And Ms. Nossel, for you.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. There's a lot that the university can do to address bigotry and hatred, whether it's anti-Semitism or anti-LGBT or racist speech on campus. It happens through education. It happens through nurturing and supporting student groups that mobilize and that unify and bring people together to draw attention to these issues. It happens through ensuring open discourse, that there aren't topics that are off limits, that, even if it's robust debate on, say, issues of Israel-Palestine, which can be very contentious, which can lead to claims of harm on both sides, that there is space for those there's even very challenging and sometimes uncomfortable conversations, that is something that the university stands for and makes possible. So there's no contradiction between creating a hospitable, welcoming environment for students from all backgrounds, be it racial, religious, or otherwise, and robust protections for free speech. In fact, they're mutually reinforcing.
But what is the best way to help administrators and professors and faculty understand that this is not an either or? It's a yes and. How can we provide the information and the tactics and techniques they need to be effective in both of these areas?
I think it's a matter of fostering greater emphasis, greater training, greater discussion. That's what we've been doing as Penn America across the country, convening faculty, students, and university leaders from across the political spectrum. People have been on opposing sides of some of these inflammatory incidents, to get them around the table and talk about, why did they invite that speaker? What was going on? How did other people react to that? What was unanticipated? Training people in the precepts of the First Amendment and free speech and the role of the university. And we find when you do that, people understand it. It clicks. They recognize this is not a contradiction, that even if you're a DEI official, you can do your job without impinging on freedom of speech. Unfortunately, I think that training is not always in place, and we've just got to reach more widely and broadly to get to those who are in those roles.
Do you believe we can use DEI to encompass discrimination against Jewish students and other minority groups?
Yes, I think DEI should look at all forms of diversity on a campus.
And are there other proactive things that universities should do to educate not just their faculty and administrators, but their students about the importance of both free speech and accepting the fact that people come from different backgrounds and have different cultural, religious beliefs?
I think so. Look, I think it's extremely important. Overwhelmingly, college students in this country are progressive. We hear that in this panel, that their conservative students are in the minority on these campuses. And so we need to present the ideas of free speech and the First Amendment in ways that make sense to progressive students, that resonate with the struggles that they want to wage. They need these rights to be protected in order to advocate for climate justice or gender justice. And so it's a matter of, if it becomes a partisan cause, if they're beset by laws and restrictions that constrain their ability to study theories and topics in American history that touch on race or religion, they're going to be alienated from the principle of free speech. I think that's a real risk with the tactics that are being pursued right now, this heavy hand of the state being inserted in the form of legislation to dictate what can and can't be taught and studied on campus.
Thank you. I wish we had time for a longer discussion, but my time has expired, and I yield back.
Thank you. And I would like to recognize Mr. Grossman.
Oh, there, okay. Okay, thank you. Mr. Joyner, I'm glad you're here today. I do think personally that we need a little more diversity on campuses. I'd like to ask you what you know about Stanford's DEI program. You hear, at least in universities in Wisconsin, great concerns about the lack of diversity among faculty. whether you measure that by religious background or religious belief, whether you measure it by political belief. Students feel that frequently they have to lie because of the hatred towards more conservative view of the world. Do you feel that the DEI offices in Stanford are diverse, like our whatever, 45% of the people you'd guess pro-life, or maybe 45 to 50% vote for President Trump, that sort of thing? What's your opinion of the diversity of the DEI offices at Stanford?
What I've seen at Stanford is that the DEI office is very one-sided. There is not much neutrality, and what we've seen in incidents like the I don't personally interact much with these DEI officials, and I don't know many students who do, despite Stanford having one of the highest rate of DEI officials per capita. What we do see from the DEI officials are these videos, like this, a 6-minute speech from the dean at Stanford Law School a couple weeks ago, the harmful language initiative released from Stanford, that really tends to censor free speech. And so these DEI officials are not really promoting this diversity of thought. They're actually squashing it in the classroom and the university.
I'm familiar with the Stanford video. It seems there was a lot of hate going on at Stanford that day. Do you feel there's a lot of hate disseminated by the DEI bureaucracy?
I'm not sure that I would say there's a lot of hate disseminated by the bureaucracy, but what we've seen, like just that video from a few weeks ago at Stanford Law School, is that these university administrators, who are supposed to be the ones enforcing these principles, which are in the university's policies, are not doing just that. And they're condemning, in this case, Judge Kyle Duncan's right to speak, condemning his actions, and they're not taking the place of a neutral university administrator and not doing their jobs.
Okay. Mr. Shapiro, could you comment in general on the cost of these DEI programs, and do they add anything to the academic atmosphere that you get in universities?
Well, the cost of tuition in university budgets has certainly exploded in the last 5, 10, 15 years, concomitant with the growth of initially bureaucracies more broadly and non-teaching staff. I think about 2010, non-teaching staff started to exceed the number of teaching full-time instructors at most institutions. And of late, most of that bureaucratic growth has been in the DEI sector. I don't have a number off the top of my head or an average.
Wait a
or
minute.
anything
Did you just say that in the universities today, we have among white-collar jobs more people who are non-teaching positions than teaching positions?
In some places, there are more non-teaching staff than students, indeed. You could have somebody wrote a cute op-ed saying maybe each student at Yale should get their own personal butler.
Well, that's shocking. But perhaps no wonder there's so many kids in debt out there, huh? Could you elaborate a little bit more on, are they making progress, the DEI, in hiring more conservative professors, or making the professors more like America in general? Are they making any progress there? Or are they really going the opposite direction, kind of the opposite of diversity? We want to stamp out diversity.
Faculty hiring is generally separate from DEI, although the DEI offices do impose diversity statements, loyalty oaths to progressive orthodoxy that have proliferated. Upwards of a quarter of faculty, I think, these days nationwide can't be hired if they don't pass that ideological litmus test. But similarly, on the other side of whether they're succeeding on their own terms, there have been campus surveys. Very good report by Scott Joener about Texas A&M specifically. Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist, has done good work on this. As the DEI offices have grown, students' comfort and sense of belonging at school has decreased, and that's especially among members of racial minorities. So even on their own terms, DEI offices are failing spectacularly.
Do you think because the Congress, the state legislatures contribute so much money to academia, that we have to step in, as we have in the private sector, and shouldn't have, quite frankly, but we have to step in and force more diversity, like, say like 40% of the English professors should be conservative, religious in thought, or that sort of thing?
Well, again, I'm hesitant to recommend state legislatures, let alone Congress, get involved in minutia of faculty hiring or impose some sort of quotas or preferences, affirmative action based on ideology. So I wouldn't recommend that. But I would, as I said, recommend strings attached to federal funding to make sure that everyone's treated equally, nobody's discriminated against, free speech rights are observed, and there's not this huge chilling effect where faculty and student alike feel like they have to walk on eggshells lest they be investigated by these diversity inquisitors.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chairwoman from Oregon, please. You're recognized.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. Ms. Trump, it seems there's biased administrators are empowered by their school's ability to define harassment, past what Title IX provides, resulting in weaponized and fluid definitions of serious terms. Would it be responsible for Congress to provide schools with clarity on what is and what is not harassment?
Yes, currently there's something called the Davis Standard in place on Title IX, and this is something that through our lawsuits we've also had universities implement in their other harassment and anti-discrimination policies. This Davis Standard has a very high bar for what kind of speech can be considered harassing conduct. And because of that, it balances, it's the best example we've seen to date that balances First Amendment rights and protections with protecting students through these policies. And that Davis Standard says that in order for speech to be considered harassing conduct, it has to be so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that to the point where students don't have equal access to education. And that is the best example we've seen, and it would be great if Congress was interested in codifying something like that.
Well, that kind of answers my next question, so I'll go ahead and leave that at that. Ms. Nossel, I think it's important to remember that my Democratic colleagues also value the First Amendment. As the Democrat witness, who is fully invested in protecting free speech on college campuses, in which specific areas should Democrats and Republicans on this committee work together to address this specific issue?
I think shining a spotlight on those shared concerns, reinforcing those shared concerns, and the basic precepts of the First Amendment. I think the kinds of legislation that we've seen, Mr. Shapiro just said he'd be hesitant to see legislation trying to dictate who could and can't be hired on college campus. And I wonder why that same concern is not raised in relation to what can and can't be taught on a college campus, or whether a college campus can have something called a DEI office that may deal with things like veterans affairs and disability rights issues, along with other topics. So I think reinforcing that basic precept of the First Amendment that says, this is not the realm of legislation, that academic freedom on campus needs to be protected, that we need a buffer zone so that it's not direct intervention and political dictates saying what can and cannot be taught. I think that's a place where I would hope we can come together.
Thank you. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Thompson.
Chairman, thank you so much. Chairman, Ranking Member, thank you for this important hearing. Very timely, obviously. We see this in the news almost every day, and so I appreciate it. My first question is for Mr. Joener. Mr. Joener, across the country, we've seen student groups on the campus, particularly religious and conservative groups, face challenges with recognition and hosting events. When you discriminate against any group, for whatever reason, that's discrimination, right? And how can we make sure all student groups are treated equally when expressing their views?
Congressman, thank you for the question. I'll point to two examples that I've witnessed on campus besides the incident at the law school. Vice President Mike Pence came to speak at Stanford about a year ago, and initially his request for funding was denied by the student government. And Matt Walsh recently came to campus a few weeks ago, and his flyers and posters were burned down around campus. And so we see this often, and it's a common occurrence. What we need individuals on campuses and students like myself to respect this principle of free speech, But then we do need university administrators who are there to enforce these principles. And what we've seen just a few weeks ago throughout the country is that these universities are hiring administrators who are not committed to this principle of free speech, which is embedded in their policies already. And so while we need this to be an integral part of each student's education, we also need to have these university administrators who are able to enforce these policies and make sure that they're doing so.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think that so much of what we're seeing is based on the administrators, the supervisors, the folks who are hired, who are not doing their due diligence and showing in a responsible way a commitment to freedom of speech, right? Our universities are supposed to be laboratories of ideas, ideals, and it shouldn't be, that scale shouldn't be, their thumb shouldn't be on the scale one way or the other, but clearly when what we see is across most universities today, I don't want to paint with a complete broad brush, but we see, you know, the individuals who are responsible for that free speech, and quite frankly, the faculty, their biases come through. And my belief is universities are there to teach you how to think in terms of applying critical analysis, right? They're not there to teach you what to think outside the scope of perhaps the specific details of a particular profession that someone may be preparing for, the technical details of that. Mrs. Trump, you talk about the rise in bias reporting systems on college campuses. While I can expect these types of 1984-esque environments occurring on campus in, say, communist China, it's hard to imagine that on American college campuses we are encouraging adults, and that's who these folks are. They're young people, some of them just becoming adults, and quite frankly, with what we used to call atypical students, they're clearly in their adult years, you know, to report on their peers for something as little as hurting someone's feelings. Do you believe that bias reporting systems, Ms. Trump, create an environment of which pressure students into specific ideologies and even a surveillance state? And how does this type of environment impact the long-term mental health of students when they enter the real world?
Yes, students are absolutely walking on eggshells on college campuses. Most of the students that I speak to are quietly telling me what their political opinions are, and oftentimes will refuse to even talk to me about their political ideas on campus or on the phone while they're on campus out of fear that someone will overhear their conversation and a target will be painted on their back. Because there is these reporting systems, as you mentioned, the bias reporting systems, where the universities have put mechanisms in place and constantly send emails and encourage students to report on each other and on faculty members. We've seen examples that range from the ridiculous ones, where someone reported Saudi Arabia that was written on a whiteboard, and there was no evidence of who wrote the word Saudi Arabia or why, but they reported because they thought, oh, my initial instinct, my immediate reaction to seeing something that might potentially be offensive is to report it to an administrator rather than to actually ask a question about it. So we've seen plenty of examples like this, and it goes to, you really start to ask the question, what's going to happen when they graduate? Because they will take these mindsets with them into the professional world, like we've already seen with cancel culture. So, you know, these are going to be tech CEOs, these are going to be people who are going to run organizations and run businesses, and they're going to take these ideas of shutting down other ideas that they don't agree with into the professional world.
Well, thank you so much, Chairman. Thank you once again for this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you so much. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Good.
Thank you, Chairman Owens. Again, thank you to our witnesses for being here today. You know, this challenge of the suppression of the free exchange of ideas on campuses, the toleration, that's an interesting word, for freedom of speech on campuses is a relatively new phenomena. It's about maybe 30 years old, and it does seem to come almost exclusively from the left, and the suppression of free speech on the right or the more conservative side. And it's ironic because it used to be that it was the left, it was the liberals, as they used to call themselves, who were the ones who had a terribly strong, in a positive way, commitment to free speech, free expression of ideas. You know, the old saying of, you know, I may disagree with what you have to say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it. That's sadly long gone on our college campuses. Mr. Joener, a study from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression found that over 60% of students on college campuses think that shouting down a speaker is an acceptable tactic to stop a campus speech, and 20% in the study said they considered it acceptable for people to use violence to stop certain speech. I personally experienced resistance to my right to free speech when invited to speak to a group of law students at the most prominent law school in my district recently. Mr. Joener, based on your experience, would you say that most of the students on campus that you interact with, whether it's at Stanford or other places that you're familiar with, do they truly understand what it means to have the right to free speech?
I don't think that the average student, a majority of the students really understand what this principle of free speech means, and we're not seeing it clearly communicated at the university or taught. In Stanford's freshman orientation, which is a week before for all freshmen, you have 2,000 students, week-long of seminars. There's no discussion on free speech. I cannot recall anything I learned in there. So we're not seeing that, but we're seeing discussion on many of these other topics like diversity, equity, inclusion.
And at universities, and obviously Stanford is a highly esteemed university, that where we are supposed to be teaching students how to think, how to reason, how to persuade, and ideas and thought and viewpoints should hold up to the challenges of scrutiny and debate and so forth, and that is so absent on many of our campuses. How would you think we could address this? How do you think this can be addressed, free speech or the lack thereof on college campuses?
Yeah, well, first off, it's these incidents that we've seen across the country that are destroying this debate in the classroom, because students are too scared to speak up, and they know that if they say something, the university administration is going to come after them. Mm-hmm. And so what we need are these university officials to truly uphold these principles, and in the future demonstrate that we're not going to be in the cyclical cycle of this fallout, this incident where a speaker shouted down and then they apologize, and then months later or years later the same thing's going to happen again. That's only contributing to the cycle and this culture that is destroying free speech, and we need these university administrators who stand up for this and stand up for it once and for all and firmly.
Yeah, it's not just happening on a macro level with university policies that are retaliatory towards free speech, but also we get reports on a micro level where students will tell us that they have to change their academic content, what they write on papers and so forth, because they're told by professors, if you express a conservative worldview, you're going to get a bad grade. Numerous students have told me that personally. Mr. Shapiro, Stanford, not to pick on Mr. Joener, but published a list of words recently deemed harmful language that is racist, violent, or biased. And some of those words what Stanford published were American, freshman, she, and so forth. And even the term trigger warning was deemed to be too triggering. Free speech zones have been implemented at universities across the country, which effectively, as you know, prohibit free speech anywhere outside that zone, and often come with requirements that you have to register to use the space. Could you comment on the impact that has, these kind of things have on the ability to learn when commonplace terms, common terms that we all would use are deemed politically incorrect or prohibited on a college campus? Yeah,
I've also seen, whether in that Stanford list or elsewhere, merit and excellence, academic rigor, these are forbidden things. Logic, reason, it's bizarre. You cannot have an institution of higher education if those things are forbidden. With respect to free speech zones, I actually encountered this when people were protesting me. At least I later learned they were protesting me a few weeks ago at the University of Denver, which is a private institution out there. And the dean, I think they just didn't want to make national headlines like Stanford has made, and that's a good goal for them to do. But they went overboard by shunting anybody who wanted to protest into these zones where I didn't even see them, and not allowing signs that weren't disruptive at all. So look, I believe strongly in the right to protest, but there's a difference between protest and disruption, time, place, and manner regulations, so you don't violate the fire code, all of these things like this. I think maximal speech is great, whether I agree with it or anybody else.
Yeah, we're sorry that you were victimized for expressing your viewpoint, and it's interesting, on a college campus, you're unqualified to be on a college campus if you were to define a woman, but you are qualified apparently to go to the Supreme Court if you can't just find what a woman is.
And my event in Denver was on the importance of free speech on college campuses.
Amazing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wahlberg. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to wave on to this very important committee and very important discussion today. On-campus organizations exist to help students find community and support in a very new and demanding chapter of their lives. Countless studies have shown that religious organizations especially improve feelings of belonging, cultural awareness, and academic success. Yet we often see universities restricting these beneficial groups from organizing, with examples from 37 states involving 93 colleges and universities, and these are just the ones that were actually reported. In 2020, the Trump administration put in place something needs to protect that button there. Protections for on-campus religious organizations. But last month, the Biden Department of Education announced proceedings to rescind those protections. That's why this week I reintroduced H.R. 1816, the Equal Campus Access Act. The legislation would revoke funding for any institution of higher education that denies religious student organizations recognition, funding, or any other rights that secular groups have. I ask for nothing more than just the sameness for all the organizations. I ask for unanimous consent to include a support letter from 34 organizations for the record.
No objection.
We should strive to reaffirm diverse theological beliefs and solidify religious freedom rather than encouraging discrimination. Mr. Joener, across the country, we've seen student groups on campus, particularly religious and conservative groups, face challenges with recognition and hosting events. How can we make sure all student groups are treated equally when expressing their views?
Mr. Wahlberg, thank you so much for the question. I'm also the president of an evangelical Christian group on campus, and so I appreciate your concerns there. Again, what I've said earlier is that, I mean, we need these individuals who are committed to this principle of free speech, but we have to have these university administrators who are hired by the university to uphold these principles. What we've seen is that those who are being hired, like Dean Tyrion Steinbach at Stanford, we're never really committed to those principles. And if those are the people that the university is hiring, then it's a very concerning trend. And putting Dean Steinbach on leave is a good start. But are there other administrators who are not committed to the principle of free speech? Are there other administrators that they're going to hire in the future who are not committed to this principle of free speech? And so we need these universities to ensure that those who are enforcing this are going to uphold free speech neutrally for all students. And what we've seen is that's currently not the case.
And a negative thumb is not on the scale for anyone in any organization. Mr. Shapiro, in your testimony, you mentioned using federal dollars as leverage when it comes to shutting down bureaucracies that completely contradict institutional policies and our nation's values. How far should Congress be willing to go?
I'm not an expert on contracting law and appropriations law, so I can't get into the nitty-gritty, but I think requiring adherence to the Constitution and federal law is important, and you mentioned the importance of treating religious student organizations the same as secular ones. I would have thought that you don't even need a regulation for that. I'm frankly appalled that this regulation is being rescinded. But as I mentioned to your colleague, Mr. Banks, a little while ago, there's a 1995 Supreme Court case called Rosenberger versus UVA, which was precisely about a religious newspaper at University of Virginia that was being denied funds that were otherwise being provided to other publications. So I don't think that you even need this regulation or, frankly, further legislation to make the point. You can just say, as long as you're complying with existing Supreme Court precedent and the sense of Congress about not even religious freedom, but equal treatment of different student organizations, I think those kinds of strings aren't, you don't even approach any sort of line about going too far.
Okay. We shouldn't have the situation where average length of time of a civil case is 29 and a half months to complete, and that's a concern. Ms. Trump, how could leaving free speech violations up to the decisions of the courts dissuade students from coming forward with complaints, and how do we address this issue?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of students are actually very afraid to speak up and complain about the policies on campus because they do fear retaliation. Often, we're a membership organization at Speech First, which means we actually are able to keep their names out of the lawsuits, which is part of the reason they're able to come to us. And I think you're right in pointing out the fact that for a student to have to try to sue their school in order to have free speech protections on campus is definitely a step too far. We shouldn't have to let it go that far. So it really comes down to what Mr. Joener was saying earlier, in that universities need to do a check and an audit of all their policies and see which ones they are targeting student speech with, and consider maybe rescinding those so that they're not going to be held legally accountable in the court of law. Additionally, they could start hiring folks, as was mentioned earlier, that actually respect the First Amendment and the free speech culture in this country.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for organizing today's hearing on protecting freedom of speech at the place where it's most vital, our institutions of higher learning. This really should not be a partisan issue in any way, shape, or form. If there's one thing that shouldn't be a partisan issue, it should be this. We should fight about everything else, exercising our First Amendment rights. But freedom of speech itself is foundational to the character of our country. And indeed, in just a few years ago, 2017, in the California legislature, I authored a resolution affirming freedom of speech as a foundational campus value. The resolution encouraged universities across the state to adopt the gold standard free speech statement, which is the University of Chicago Statement of Free Expression. Now, this is a Democrat supermajority in California, and it passed our legislature unanimously. This was just in 2017. In 2016, President Barack Obama had this to say. He said, "There's been a trend around the country of trying to get colleges to disinvite speakers with a different point of view or disrupt a politician's rally. Don't do that," Obama said, "no matter how ridiculous or offensive you might find the things that come out of their mouths. There will be times when you shouldn't compromise your core values, your integrity, and you will have the responsibility to speak up in the face of injustice. But listen, engage. If the other side has a point, learn from them. If they're wrong, rebut them, teach them, beat them on the battlefield of ideas." And yet, a few years later, we continue to see incidents like we saw, well, just recently in California at UC Davis and at your university, Mr. Joener, Stanford. And I understand you're the executive editor of the Stanford Review, is that right?
Yes, I am.
And I understand your publication has done some great work covering the attacks on free speech that have happened on campus.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
So what I want to ask you is about what the mentality you think is of the students who created these disruptions. Because these are Stanford law students, presumably very bright, and yet we saw them so flagrantly defying the admonition from former President Obama, and not even letting someone of opposing viewpoints speak. They seem to think that stopping the words from being expressed was the proper response to their disagreement. So how do you think it is that some of the brightest students we have in this country don't seem to understand this basic American value?
Absolutely. It's quite concerning. So thank you for the question, Congressman. Stanford Law School, I believe, is currently the second-ranked law school in the country. We know that these students will go on to be, the next business leaders, sitting in these very chairs one day, and even at the Supreme Court. I mean, these are the students that Stanford Law is graduating. But these students, and this was over 100 student protesters here, completely disrupted Judge Duncan's speech. And if you watch the video and read the details in my article or other articles, they're holding obscene signs, heckling obscene remarks that I wouldn't even state here in this setting. And so I don't know what has brought these students to take on this worldview that believes they can just shut down someone else's speech because they disagree with them or have said something controversial. And so I've said we need university administrators in place to enforce it, and we absolutely do. But we need them to educate these students on these principles, and we need these students to uphold these principles of free speech themselves. And maybe that starts early on. It should happen in college, but maybe it needs to be something that's done and is not being well done in early education.
I think you're exactly right. I think that it starts at the primary, secondary school level. We need to get back to teaching civics in a real way. But one thing I did find encouraging in the dean of your university's response, Jenny Martinez, is she said that they're going to, one step the law school will take will be holding a mandatory half-day session for all students on the topic of freedom of speech and the norms of the legal profession. I think that this is a good idea. Now, it's not going to compensate for the shortcomings we see at our at the secondary and primary level around the country. But I think that the more universities that can do something like this, not necessarily in response to incidents that occur on campus, but just as a matter of your basic training, your basic orientation when you come to school, I think that that'd be something of great value. And Mr. Chair, I think that'd be perhaps something that we could look at as a committee as to how we can encourage that sort of education about the importance of the First Amendment and free speech at our universities. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. As we begin to close this out, I want to thank again our witnesses for taking the time to testify before the subcommittee today. Let me just give you a quick observation. First of all, thank you for each and every one of you for being engaged in this particular topic and really showing our country the way that the old American way used to be. We can respectfully agree to disagree. We talk together, and eventually we figure out a way to come to that space where free speech is what we want to get to. So I want to thank you for that. Also, Jonas, I just want to say I'm so impressed with someone your age. I would have never done what you're doing right now at my age, believe me, never. So it gives me hope that we do have remarkable young people that know how to articulate themselves, how to be courageous where you stand, and this is one of the most important things we can do. So I just want to say that as we close this out, and without objections, there will be no further business, and subcommittee now stands adjourned.